Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a young craftsman seeking divine guidance, a narrative inspired by Proverbs chapter 16. This story explores the beauty of surrendering our plans to God's wisdom and teaches us about trusting in the Lord's direction for our lives, even when our own understanding fails us. As you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun had not yet broken over the hills of Judea when Tobias opened his eyes. The air in his small stone house carried the coolness of night still, that particular quality of darkness just before dawn, when the world holds its breath between one day and the next. He lay on his mat for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his father's gentle breathing from the other room, the distant bleating of a neighbor's goat stirring in its pen, the whisper of wind through the olive trees that grew along the eastern wall of their courtyard. Tobias was 20 years old, though some days he felt much older, and other days, particularly lately, he felt he knew nothing at all about the world or his place in it. His hands, even in rest, bore the marks of his trade. Calluses ridged his palms where the tools pressed day after day. His fingers carried the small scars of a carpenter's life, those thin white lines that come from splinters and slipped chisels and the rough kiss of unplaned wood. He flexed them now in the dim light filtering through the high window, watching the tendons move beneath the skin. His father, Joachim, had been a carpenter before him, as had his father's father, going back through generations that disappeared into the mists of family memory. It was a good trade, an honest trade. In their village of Beth Shemesh, halfway between Jerusalem and the coastal plains, there was always work for a man who knew how to join wood, to build a door that would hang true, to fashion a yoke that would not chafe the ox's neck, to repair the handles of plows and create the frames for roofs. But for the past several months, since the autumn rains had come and gone, Tobias had felt a restlessness he could not name. It sat in his chest like a stone, not painful exactly, but present, undeniable. He would be working on a piece, perhaps shaping a cedar plank for a merchant storehouse, and his hands would slow, and he would find himself staring at nothing, his mind wandering down paths he could not quite follow. His father had noticed. Joachim noticed everything, though he spoke little. 2 weeks ago, as they sat together after the evening meal, the old man had looked at his son across the low table and said simply, "You are seeking something." It was not a question. Tobias had nodded, unable to meet his father's eyes. "I do not know what, Abba." "Then perhaps," Joachim had said, his voice like worn leather, gentle and strong, "it is time to ask one who does know." Now, as the first light began to paint the eastern sky the color of copper, Tobias rose from his mat and wrapped his outer cloak around his shoulders. He moved quietly through the house, though he knew his father was likely already awake, as he was every morning, reciting the Shema in the pre-dawn darkness. Tobias could hear the whisper of the familiar words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, The Lord is one. He stepped out into the courtyard. The stones beneath his feet were cool and slightly damp with dew. Their home was modest, but well kept. His mother, who had died when Tobias was 12, had loved flowers, and his father still tended the small garden she had planted, herbs and flowering vines that climbed the courtyard walls. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, sweet and faint. Tobias walked to the workshop, a separate structure that opened onto the courtyard. Inside, the familiar smell of sawdust and wood oil and that indefinable scent of work greeted him. His current project sat on the long workbench, a cabinet commissioned by one of the elders of the village, made from acacia wood, half finished. He had planned the joints carefully, marked the measurements, begun the careful work of shaping and fitting. It was good work. It would be a fine piece when completed. But as he stood there in the growing light, looking at it, he felt that restlessness again, that sense of something incomplete, something missing that had nothing to do with the cabinet at all. He had made a decision 3 days ago, after much thought and prayer. Today, he would leave the village for a time. He would make a journey to Jerusalem, to the temple, to seek wisdom from the teachers there, to pray, to perhaps find whatever it was his soul seemed to be searching for. His father had given his blessing, though Tobias could see the concern in the old man's eyes, the worry that came from love. The plans of the heart belong to man, his father had said, quoting words Tobias recognized from the teachings they heard in the synagogue. But the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Go, my son, seek wisdom, but remember always to commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Tobias had prepared carefully for the journey. He had a leather bag packed with bread, dried figs, a small flask of olive oil, a larger skin of water. He had coins saved from his work, enough for the journey and for lodging if needed, though he planned to sleep under the stars when possible. He wore his study sandals, the leather thick and well-oiled. His outer cloak was wool, good for cool nights. As the sun finally broke over the hills, spilling golden light across the village, Tobias returned to the house. His father was in the main room, standing near the small altar where they kept the mezuzah and the oil lamp that burned continuously. Joachim turned as his son entered, and for a moment neither spoke. Then the old man stepped forward and placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders. "The Lord bless you and keep you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." "Amen," Tobias whispered. He embraced his father, feeling the old man's thin frame, the strength that remained despite his years. When they parted, there were tears in both their eyes. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," Joachim said. "Lean not on your own understanding. In all my ways I will acknowledge him," Tobias replied, completing the familiar verse. And then, with the sun climbing higher, warming the stones and the air, Tobias walked through the village of his birth, past the houses he had known all his life, past the well where he had drawn water as a boy, past the synagogue where he had learned to read the Torah, and out onto the road that led east toward Jerusalem, toward the unknown, toward whatever God had planned for him. The road from Beth Shemesh to Jerusalem was well traveled, a path beaten smooth by countless feet and hooves and cartwheels over centuries. It wound through the hill country of Judah, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, passing through small villages and past terraced fields where farmers were already at work, guiding their plows behind oxen, the metal blades turning the earth. Tobias walked with a steady pace, not hurrying, but not dawdling either. He had calculated that if he maintained good progress, he could reach Jerusalem by the evening of the second day, perhaps sooner, if he encountered no delays. But he was not in a desperate rush. This journey, he sensed, was as much about the traveling as the arriving. The morning was beautiful. The sky stretched above him, that particular blue that seemed to exist only in the early hours, deep and pure. White clouds moved slowly across it like sheep grazing in celestial pastures. The hills around him were still green from the winter rains, dotted with wildflowers, poppies blazing red among the grasses, small white flowers he did not know the names of, purple thistles standing tall and defiant. As he walked, Tobias found his mind settling into a rhythm with his feet. Step, 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 breathe. The restlessness that had plagued him for months seemed to ease slightly, as if the simple act of moving forward, of making a decision and following through with it, brought its own kind of peace. He thought about the words his father had spoken, the Proverbs that the old man loved to quote. Joachim had never been a learned man in the formal sense. He could read, but slowly, and his knowledge of Torah came more from listening in the synagogue than from personal study. But he had a gift for remembering the wisdom sayings, the proverbs that had been passed down through generations, and he deployed them at the right moments, like a master craftsman selecting exactly the right tool for a particular task. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Tobias turned the words over in his mind as he walked. What did it mean, truly, to commit one's works to the Lord? He had always tried to be faithful, to follow the commandments, to pray, to observe the Sabbath, to give to the poor when he could. But was that committing his works, or was that simply doing what was expected? By midday, the sun was high and hot. Tobias stopped in the shade of a large terebinth tree that grew beside the road. He sat on a flat stone, removed his sandals, and rubbed his feet. They were not yet sore, but he knew from experience that care taken early in a journey would pay dividends later. He ate some bread and figs, drank sparingly from his water skin, knowing he would pass a well in the next village where he could refill it. As he sat there, he saw other travelers on the road. A family passed, heading west, away from Jerusalem. The father led a donkey loaded with goods. The mother carried a small child, and 2 older children walked alongside. They greeted Tobias with the traditional shalom, and he returned it. Peace to you. Then came a group of men, merchants by the look of them, with several donkeys laden with heavy packs. They moved with the purposeful air of those whose time is money. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard, nodded to Tobias as they passed. Going to Jerusalem, young man? I am, Tobias replied. For the festival? Tobias realized with a small start that Passover was indeed approaching. He had been so caught up in his own internal turmoil that he had not connected his journey with the festival calendar. But of course, this was the season when Jews from all over Judea and Galilee, and even from distant lands, made pilgrimage to the holy city. Yes, he said, though it had not been his primary purpose for the festival. The merchant smiled. May your journey be blessed. The roads are safe this season, praise God. The Romans keep the peace, whatever else one might say about them. After they passed, Tobias sat a while longer, considering. Perhaps it was not coincidence that his restlessness had peaked at this particular season. Perhaps God had been drawing him toward this time, this journey all along. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. If God was indeed directing his steps, then what did that mean about the decisions he thought he had been making himself? He remembered another saying his father loved, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Was that what was happening? Had he been planning his way, thinking himself in control, while all along God had been quietly establishing something else entirely? Tobias put his sandals back on, shouldered his bag, and continued walking. The afternoon stretched before him, warm and bright. The landscape began to change subtly as he traveled east. The hills grew slightly steeper, the valleys between them deeper. He could see terraces cut into the hillsides, ancient stonework that had been there for generations beyond counting, each terrace supporting olive trees or grapevines or small plots of wheat. Late in the afternoon, he came to a village he had been to once before, years ago, with his father. It was called Bethlehem, a small place, perhaps 50 families, built on a hilltop with a commanding view of the surrounding country. Tobias knew there was a well in the center of the village, and he made his way there. The well was ancient, its stones worn smooth by thousands of hands over hundreds of years. Several women were there, drawing water, and they looked at him with the natural curiosity villagers have for strangers. But when he greeted them respectfully and asked permission to draw water, they smiled and nodded, and one older woman even offered him a cup to drink from. "You are traveling to Jerusalem?" she asked as he drank gratefully. "I am, grandmother." "A good time for it. The city will be full soon with pilgrims." She studied him with sharp eyes. "You have the look of a craftsman." "Carpenter?" Tobias nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" She laughed to sound like water over stones. "I have lived 73 years, young man. I know the look of different trades. Your hands tell stories. You build things." "I try to," Tobias said. "Trying is good," she said. "But there is a saying I heard from my father, who heard it from his father. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain." "Do you know this?" "I do," Tobias said. "It is from the Psalms." "Yes, my father was a builder too. He taught me that all work, if it is to last, must have God's blessing in it, not just in the words we say before we begin, but woven into the very fabric of what we do." She patted his hand. "You are young. You have time to learn this, but learn it well." After refilling his water skin and thanking the women, Tobias left the village and continued on. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He calculated that he could walk another 2 hours before the light failed entirely. He wanted to put more distance between himself and Beth Shemesh before stopping for the night. As he walked through the golden light of late afternoon, he thought about the woman at the well and her words, "Unless the Lord builds the house." He had heard that verse many times, of course, but hearing it from her, in that moment, on this journey, it struck him differently. What houses had he been trying to build? What structures, physical or otherwise, had he been constructing in his life without truly inviting God into the foundation? The restlessness stirred again, but differently now. Not an anxious fluttering, but something deeper, a sense of things shifting beneath the surface, like tectonic plates adjusting in the deep places of the earth. When the sun finally touched the horizon, Tobias began looking for a place to spend the night. He found it in a grove of oak trees set back slightly from the road, a place that showed signs of being used by other travelers. There was a ring of stones for a fire, though he did not need one on this warm night. The ground was relatively flat and soft, with fallen leaves. He spread his cloak and sat, eating more bread and figs, finishing with a handful of almonds he had brought. Then, as the stars began to appear one by one, like lamps being lit in the windows of heaven, he prayed. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe," he whispered into the gathering darkness. "You have kept me alive and sustained me and brought me to this season. I do not know what I am seeking, Lord. I know only that I am seeking. If you have placed this restlessness in my heart, then I pray you will also show me its purpose. Guide me in your paths. Teach me your ways." The night deepened around him. He could hear the sounds of the countryside after dark, the call of night birds, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant bark of a dog in some unseen village. The stars multiplied until they filled the entire sky, a vast tapestry of light against the darkness. Tobias lay on his back, looking up at them, feeling very small and very young, but not in a bad way. Small in the way a child feels small when held by a strong father. Young in the way that means there is still so much to learn, so much to experience, so much to become. "The plans of the heart belong to man," he whispered to the stars, "but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord." He did not fully understand what that meant, but he sensed, in a way that bypassed understanding entirely, that he was beginning to live it. Sleep came slowly, gently, like a tide rising. His last conscious thought was a fragment of prayer, formless, wordless, but real. And then the darkness took him, and he rested. When Tobias woke the next morning, the sun was already well above the horizon. He had slept more deeply than he had in weeks, and he woke feeling refreshed in both body and spirit. The grove was alive with birdsong, a complex symphony of different voices, all praising the new day in their own languages. He prayed the morning prayers, took care of his body's needs, ate sparingly, and packed his few belongings. Then he returned to the road and resumed his journey toward Jerusalem. The landscape continued to change as he traveled. The hills became more dramatic, the valleys deeper. He could see in the distance the shape of mountains, their peaks still holding the memory of winter snow. The road itself was busier now. He passed merchants and pilgrims, farmers taking goods to market, a Roman patrol on horseback who barely glanced at him as they cantered past. By late morning, he found himself walking alongside another traveler, a man perhaps 10 years older than himself, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. They fell into easy conversation, as travelers often do, sharing the road, making it feel less long. The man's name was Matthias, and he was a shepherd from the hills near Hebron. He was also heading to Jerusalem to sell wool and to observe the Passover. "I make this journey twice a year," Matthias said as they walked, "spring and fall. I know this road better than I know the features of my own wife's face. God forgive me." He laughed, "though I love her dearly." "Do you have children?" Tobias asked. "5, 3 sons, 2 daughters. The oldest boy, he wants to be a shepherd like me. The second, he has a head for numbers. I think he will be a scribe or perhaps work for a tax collector." Matthias made a face. "Not my first choice, but if it is God's will, who am I to argue?" They walked in companionable silence for a while. Then Matthias said, "You have the look of someone chewing on a question too big for his mouth." Tobias glanced at him, startled. "Is it that obvious? To one who knows how to look, yes. I spend my days with sheep, young friend. You learn to read faces. What troubles you?" Tobias found himself wanting to speak, to unburden himself to this stranger who would likely never cross his path again. Sometimes it was easier to speak truth to those we did not know than to those we loved. "I am a carpenter," he began. "It is a good trade. I learned it from my father, who learned it from his father. I am skilled enough. I can make my living, but lately I have felt uncertain." like perhaps I am meant for something else, or meant to understand something I do not yet understand. Matthias nodded slowly. And so you journey to Jerusalem to seek answers? Yes, though I am not sure what questions I am even asking. The shepherd was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I knew a man once, years ago. He was a potter, made beautiful vessels, the kind that wealthy people bought for their homes. He was very successful, very skilled, but he was not happy. He felt, as you say, uncertain, like something was missing. What did he do? Tobias asked. He prayed. He fasted. He sought counsel from the wise men in his village, and eventually he understood something important. The problem was not his trade. The problem was that he had been working for his own glory, for his own success, for his own satisfaction. He had never truly offered his work to God. What changed? He began to pray before he started each piece, not just a quick blessing, but a real prayer. He would ask God, what do you want me to create today? How can this vessel serve your purposes? He began to see his work not as a means to his own ends, but as a form of worship and offering. Did that make him happy? Tobias asked. Matthias smiled. Happy? I do not know if that is the word. Content, perhaps. At peace. He told me once that he finally understood what it meant to commit his work to the Lord. It did not mean working harder or being more pious. It meant surrendering the work itself, trusting that if he did his best and offered it to God, the outcome was God's concern, not his. They walked on, and Tobias felt those words settling into him like rain into dry ground. Committing his work to the Lord, surrendering the outcome, offering the work itself as worship. Around midday they stopped at another well, this one in a small village that seemed to consist of nothing more than a few houses clustered around the water source. Matthias knew the people there, and they were welcomed warmly. An old man brought out bread and goat cheese to share, and they sat in the shade of a large fig tree, eating and talking. The old man, whose name was Simeon, had a grandson about Tobias's age, and he asked what trade Tobias followed. When Tobias told him, Simeon nodded appreciatively. A carpenter. Good, good. You know, I heard a teaching once from a rabbi who passed through here many years ago. He said that every good carpenter must understand something important. You can measure and plan and design all you want, but the wood itself has something to say. The grain has a direction. The knots have their own character. A good carpenter works with the wood, not against it. My father taught me the same. Tobias said, Yes, but did he teach you this? Simeon leaned forward, his eyes bright. God is like that with us. He is the master carpenter. We are the wood. We have our own grain, our own knots, our own character. And God works with us, not against us. But we must trust his hands. We must yield to his tools. Tobias felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been tight. I think I have been trying to decide my own shape, he said slowly, trying to figure out what I should become, where I should go, what I should do, all on my own. Simeon smiled. And how is that working for you? Tobias laughed, surprised by his own laughter. Not very well, grandfather. No, it usually does not. But here's the beautiful thing. The moment you realize you cannot do it alone, you are ready to begin actually doing it with God. Simeon patted his hand. You are on the right path, young man. Keep walking. When they left the village, Matthias and Tobias continued together, and the shepherd told stories of his life in the hills, stories of lost sheep found, of wolves outsmarted, of lambs born in the dead of winter against all odds. Each story seemed to Tobias to carry a lesson, though Matthias never stated them outright. He simply told the stories and let them speak for themselves. Late in the afternoon, they came to a place where the road forked. Matthias would continue east, while the main road curved slightly north toward Jerusalem. "I must leave you here, my friend," Matthias said. "My brother has a farm down that way, and I promised to stop and help him with some repairs before I go on to the city." They embraced as brothers might, though they had known each other less than a day. "Thank you," Tobias said, "for your company and your wisdom." "Wisdom?" Matthias laughed. "I am just an old shepherd who talks too much. But I will say this. You are seeking God's will for your life, yes? Yes. Then remember this proverb. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. You can plan all you want, Tobias, but trust that God is directing. And when you find yourself somewhere you did not expect to be, do not be surprised. God's directions often look nothing like our plans." With those words, they parted. Tobias watched the shepherd walk down the smaller road until he disappeared around a bend. Then he turned and continued toward Jerusalem. The sun was lower now, perhaps 2 hours from setting. The air had that particular quality of late afternoon, the light golden and thick like honey. Tobias felt different than he had when he started the journey the day before. Not that his questions were answered, but the urgency of them had eased. He was beginning to understand, in a wordless way, that the answers would come in their own time, in God's time, not his. As the road climbed into the hills, Jerusalem came into view for the first time. Even from a distance, even though he had seen it before, the sight took his breath. The city sat on its hills like a crown, its walls white in the late sunlight, the temple rising at its heart, the gold on its roof blazing like a second sun. Tobias stopped in the road, just looking. Other travelers passed him, some heading toward the city, some away, but he stood still, drinking in the sight. "Holy city," he whispered, "city of peace, city of God." He felt tears on his cheeks and did not wipe them away. This was a holy moment, standing on this road, looking at that city, feeling his own smallness and God's greatness, knowing that he was part of something vast and ancient and good. He walked on as the sun sank lower, and by the time he reached the gates of Jerusalem, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue above. The gates were still open, guarded by Roman soldiers who looked bored and hot in their armor. They barely glanced at Tobias as he passed through. Inside the walls, the city was alive with activity. Merchants were closing their stalls for the evening. Families were hurrying home before dark. The smell of cooking fires and baking bread and incense hung in the air. The streets were narrow and crowded, the stone buildings rising on either side, creating canyons of shadow. Tobias made his way through the labyrinth of streets, following the flow of people generally upward, toward the Temple Mount. He had decided that he would sleep somewhere near the temple if possible, perhaps in one of the courtyards where pilgrims often gathered. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, he would enter the temple courts and seek out the teachers, the wise men who could perhaps help him understand what God was calling him toward. He found a place finally, a corner of a large courtyard where other travelers had already settled for the night. There was an ancient olive tree there, its trunk thick and gnarled, and Tobias sat with his back against it, eating the last of his bread and some olives he had purchased from a vendor near the gate. Around him, the city slowly quieted as night deepened. He could hear conversations in the darkness, families talking, children being hushed to sleep, someone singing a psalm in a voice worn smooth by age. The stars overhead were the same stars he had seen the night before in the grove, the same stars that shone over his father's house in Beth Shemesh. But somehow They looked different here, brighter, perhaps, or closer. Tobias prayed the evening prayers, then sat for a long time just watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the holy city. His mind was quieter than it had been in months. The restlessness had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt more like anticipation than anxiety. He thought about all the words he had heard over the past 2 days, his father's Proverbs, the old woman at the well in Bethlehem, Matthias the shepherd and his story of the potter, Simeon and his teaching about God the carpenter. Each conversation had felt random at the time, but now, looking back, Tobias could see a pattern, a thread running through them all. Surrender, trust, commit your work to the Lord. Let God direct your steps. I am trying, Lord, he whispered into the darkness. I am trying to understand. And in the silence that followed, which was not really silence at all, but was filled with the breathing of the sleeping city, the whisper of wind through the olive tree, the distant call of a night watchman, Tobias felt something, not a voice, not a vision, but a presence, a sense of being known, being seen, being loved. He slept that night with his head pillowed on his bag, his cloak wrapped around him, and he dreamed of his father's workshop, of hands shaping wood, of the smell of cedar and olive and acacia. And in the dream there were other hands too, larger hands, invisible but real, guiding the work, steadying the tools, blessing the creation. Morning came slowly to Jerusalem, the sky lightening in gradual stages, from black to deep blue to pale rose to gold. Tobias woke before dawn, as was his custom, and found that many of the other pilgrims in the courtyard were also stirring. There was a well in the corner of the courtyard, and he washed his face and hands, the water cold and shocking and wonderful. He prayed the morning prayers with extra focus today, feeling the weight and beauty of the ancient words. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to engage in words of Torah. After prayers, he made his way through the waking streets toward the Temple Mount. Even this early, there were people moving, merchants setting up their stalls, priests heading toward the temple for the morning sacrifice, pilgrims like himself seeking to enter the holy place. The temple complex was vast, far larger than Tobias remembered from his previous visit years ago. He entered through the southern gates, climbing the broad steps, passing through the outer walls into the court of the Gentiles. Here, even in the early morning, there was activity. Money changers were setting up their tables. Vendors of sacrificial animals were arranging their pens of doves and lambs. The air filled with the sound of many languages as Jews from across the known world converged on this sacred space. Tobias stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the size, the noise, the sheer presence of the place. Then he made his way through the crowd, heading toward the inner courts where he had been told the teachers and rabbis often gathered to teach and debate. He found them in the court of Israel, a group of perhaps 6 or 7 men, some young, some old, sitting on the stones, books and scrolls spread before them. A small crowd had gathered around them, people listening to their discussion. Tobias approached quietly, not wanting to disturb, and stood at the edge of the group, listening. They were discussing a passage from the prophets, Jeremiah, if Tobias heard correctly. The eldest of the teachers, a man with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, was speaking. The prophet says that the Lord will give us shepherds after his own heart, who will feed us with knowledge and understanding. But what does this mean? How do we recognize such shepherds? How do we know who truly speaks with God's wisdom and who speaks only their own thoughts? A younger teacher, perhaps in his 30s, spoke up. Surely, Rabbi, we recognize them by their fruit. Do their teachings lead people closer to God or farther away? Do their words bring life or death? Good, good, the old rabbi said. But how do we know what brings life? Cannot a teaching feel good in the moment, but be poison in the long term? Cannot truth sometimes taste bitter before it becomes sweet? The discussion continued, flowing back and forth, questions leading to more questions, insights building on insights. Tobias listened, fascinated. This was unlike anything in his village synagogue, where the teaching was more straightforward, less probing. After perhaps an hour, there was a natural break in the discussion. The old rabbi looked up, and his eyes found Tobias standing at the edge of the group. "You, young man," he called, "you have been listening intently. Do you have a question for us?" Tobias felt every eye turned toward him. His mouth went dry. But something in the old man's expression was kind, inviting, and he found himself stepping forward. "Rabbi," he said, his voice not as steady as he would have liked, "I have come to Jerusalem seeking wisdom. I am a carpenter by trade, and I am skilled in my work, but I feel—" He paused, searching for words. "I feel as though I am building without a foundation, as though I am constructing something, but I don't know what, or why, or for whom." The old rabbi nodded slowly. "A good question. A very good question. What is your name, carpenter?" "Tobias, Rabbi, from Beth Shemesh." "Tobias, welcome. You know, there is a saying in the Proverbs, the wisdom of Solomon, 'Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established.' Have you heard this?" "Yes, Rabbi. My father quotes it often. Your father is wise. But tell me, Tobias, do you understand what it means to commit your work to the Lord?" Tobias hesitated. "I have been trying to understand, Rabbi. I thought it meant to pray before I work, to follow the commandments, to be faithful." "These things are good," the old rabbi said. "But tell me, Tobias, do you understand what it means to commit your work to the Lord?" Tobias hesitated. "I have been trying to understand, Rabbi. I thought it meant to pray before I work, to follow the commandments, to be faithful." "These things are good," the old rabbi said, nodding slowly. "But they are the beginning, not the fullness. To commit your work to the Lord is not merely to dedicate it with words. It is to recognize that the work itself, from its conception to its completion, belongs to God. Your hands may shape the wood, but whose hands guide yours? Your mind may design the joints, but whose wisdom illuminates your understanding?" The rabbi paused, letting the question settle. Around them, the other students and listeners had grown quiet, attentive. "Tell me about your last project," the rabbi said. "What were you building?" "A cabinet, Rabbi, for one of the village elders. Acacia wood with careful joinery." "And when you planned this cabinet, whose glory did you seek? Your own, that men might say, 'Tobias is a skilled craftsman,' or God's, that the cabinet might serve its purpose well and bring order and beauty into the world?" Tobias felt heat rise to his face. He had been proud of that cabinet, proud of the precision of his measurements, the elegance of his design. I wanted it to be good work, Rabbi, work I could be proud of. And there is nothing wrong with taking joy in work well done," the old rabbi said gently. "God himself looked at his creation and called it good. But the question is, where does the joy come from? From the praise of men, or from the knowledge that you have used the gifts God gave you in service of his purposes?" One of the younger teachers spoke up. "Perhaps, Rabbi Eleazar, the young man needs a more concrete understanding. Tobias, when you build, Do you fight against the wood or work with its nature? Tobias considered. I work with it, master. Each piece of wood has its own character. The grain runs in a certain direction. There are knots that must be worked around. A good carpenter respects these things. Exactly, the young teacher said, his eyes lighting up. And so it is with God and us. We are His materials, His tools, His workmanship. He does not force us against our nature, but works with what He has made, bringing out the beauty that lies within. And when we commit our work to Him, we are saying, Lord, I am your tool. Use me as you will. Shape through me what you desire to create. Rabbi Eleazar nodded approvingly. Well said, Jeremiah. And Tobias, there is another layer. When your plans are established by the Lord, it does not mean that everything will go according to your design. It means that even when the wood splits unexpectedly, even when the customer changes their mind, even when your tools break, all of these things can be woven into a greater pattern that you cannot yet see. Tobias felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he had not fully realized was there. So, the restlessness I feel, perhaps it is not because I am doing the wrong work, but because I have been doing it for the wrong reasons. Perhaps, Rabbi Eleazar said, or perhaps the restlessness itself is God's tool shaping you, preparing you for something new. The heart that is content with itself has stopped growing. The heart that questions, that seeks, that yearns. This is a heart that is still soft enough for God to mold. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing like water, finding its course through stone. Other listeners asked questions, shared their own struggles. A merchant spoke of learning to trust God with his business ventures. A widow told of how she had committed her grief to the Lord and found not the removal of sorrow, but the strength to carry it. As the sun climbed higher and the heat of the day began to settle over the temple courts, Rabbi Eleazar rose, signaling an end to the morning's teaching. But he gestured for Tobias to remain. "Walk with me," the old man said. They left the court of Israel and made their way through the crowds, past the money changers and the sellers of sacrificial animals, through the beautiful gate and out into the city. Rabbi Eleazar moved slowly but with purpose. His staff clicking on the stone pavement, he led Tobias to a quieter part of the city, to a small garden overlook that gave a view of the Kidron Valley below. Olive trees provided shade, and the noise of the city faded to a distant murmur. "Sit," the rabbi said, lowering himself onto a stone bench. Tobias sat beside him, and for a long moment neither spoke. Below them, the valley stretched out, ancient and timeless. The same sun that warmed them now had warmed Abraham, Moses, David, all the fathers of their faith. "I was a young man once," Rabbi Eleazar said finally, his voice soft. "Younger than you, perhaps 17? I was training to be a merchant, like my father, good with numbers, good with people. It was a prosperous trade, but I felt," he paused, searching for the word, "hollow, as though I was building something that would not last." That did not matter. "What did you do?" Tobias asked. "I ran away," the rabbi said, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. "Not physically, but internally. I threw myself into the work, tried to outrun the feeling, made more money, earned more respect, and the hollowness only grew." "When did it change?" "When I stopped running. When I finally asked the question I had been avoiding, 'Lord, what do you want from my life?' And you know what I heard?" "What, Rabbi?" "Nothing." Eleazar smiled at Tobias's surprise. "No voice from heaven, no vision, just nothing. Or so I thought at first. But in the silence, in the waiting, something began to shift. I started to notice things I had overlooked. The way my father's face lit up when he helped a customer find exactly what they needed. The satisfaction of a fair deal that benefited both parties. The Torah portion we read in synagogue one Sabbath about Abraham's servant finding a wife for Isaac and how he prayed for success, not for his own glory, but so that his master's purposes would be fulfilled. "You stayed a merchant?" Tobias asked. "For a time, but with a different heart. I began to see each transaction as a sacred trust, each customer as a person bearing the image of God, each calculation not as a means to wealth, but as a practice of the honesty and integrity that Torah commands." And slowly, over years, other opportunities opened. A chance to study with a traveling rabbi, an invitation to teach in my synagogue, eventually a call to Jerusalem. The old man looked at Tobias with eyes that held both depth and kindness. "I tell you this not because your path will be like mine, but because the question is the same for all of us. Not what do I want to do with my life, but what does God want to do through my life?" And that question cannot be answered in a day or even a year. It is answered in the living, in the daily choice to commit each small work to Him. "But how do I know?" Tobias asked, and he heard the plea in his own voice. "How do I know what He wants?" "You walk," Eleazar said simply. "You pray. You work with the gifts He has given you. You pay attention to the doors that open and the doors that close. You listen to the wisdom of others while also trusting what God speaks in your own heart. And you remember that He is more concerned with who you are becoming than with what you are producing." He placed a weathered hand on Tobias's shoulder. "The fact that you are here, asking these questions, seeking wisdom, this itself is an answer. God is at work in you. Trust that. And when you return to your workshop, return with new eyes. See each piece of wood as a gift, each project as an opportunity to practice faithfulness in small things. And know that the Lord who establishes your plans may have purposes you cannot yet imagine." They sat together in the dappled shade of the olive trees, and Tobias felt a peace settling over him that he had not felt in many months. Not the peace of having all answers, but the peace of knowing that it was all right not to have them. The peace of a child held by a father who knows the way, even when the child does not. "Thank you, Rabbi," Tobias said quietly. Eleazar smiled. "Thank the one who brought you here, my son. I am just an old man who has learned a few things by stumbling through many years. Now go, explore the city, pray in the temple. Let this place work on your soul, and when it is time to return home, you will know." Tobias spent the next 3 days in Jerusalem, and they were unlike any days he had known before. He rose each morning before dawn and made his way to the temple for the morning prayers and sacrifices. The ritual of it, the ancient words spoken by thousands of voices, the smoke of the incense rising like prayers themselves, all of it began to work on him in ways he could not articulate. He walked the streets of the city, observing, a potter at his wheel, hands wet with clay, shaping a vessel with patient pressure, a weaver at her loom, fingers flying through threads in a pattern so complex it seemed impossible she could keep track, yet the cloth emerged perfect, a baker pulling bread from his oven, the golden loaves still steaming, and the way he smiled as he handed one to a child who clearly could not pay. Each scene felt like a lesson, though Tobias could not have said exactly what the lesson was. Something about attention, something about care, something about the sacred hiding in the ordinary, waiting to be noticed. On the second evening, he found himself back in the temple courts at twilight. The crowds had thinned, most pilgrims having returned to their lodgings for the night. Tobias stood in the court of Israel, looking toward the inner sanctuary where only the priests could go, where the Holy of Holies lay behind its veil. An old priest was trimming the lamps, ensuring they had enough oil to burn through the night. His movements were slow, careful, reverent. He had probably performed the same task thousands of times, yet he did it as though it were his first time, as though each lamp mattered infinitely. Tobias approached quietly. "Forgive me, Father. May I ask you something?" The priest turned, his face creased with age, but his eyes clear. "Of course, my son. You tend these lamps every day?" "Every evening, yes, as priests have done since the days of Moses, as we will do until the Messiah comes and makes all things new." "Does it ever feel repetitive, the same task, day after day?" The priest smiled, a gentle expression. "Does the sun grow bored of rising? Do the stars tire of their courses? Repetition is not the enemy of meaning, young man. Often it is the vessel of it. In doing the same sacred task day after day, we learn its depths. We discover nuances we missed before. The repetition does not diminish the work, it sanctifies it." He gestured to the lamps. "Each evening, I trim these wicks. I pour this oil. I light these flames. And each evening, I remember, I am continuing a chain that stretches back through generations. I am ensuring that the light of God's presence never goes out in this place. I am performing an act of faithfulness that matters not because it is novel, but because it is true." "I am a carpenter," Tobias said. "Sometimes I wonder if my work matters, if building cabinets and yokes and plow handles is significant enough." The priest studied him for a long moment. "Do you know what holds up the roof of this temple?" "Beams?" Tobias said, uncertain where this was going. "Yes, massive cedar beams, cut and shaped by carpenters." "Do you know what allows the priests to enter the Holy of Holies?" "The veil? Before the veil, the doors, carved and fitted by woodworkers." "Do you know what contained the tablets of the law when Moses brought them down from Sinai?" "The ark," Tobias whispered. "The ark of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, yes, made by Bezalel, whom God himself filled with his spirit, with skill, ability, and knowledge in all kinds of crafts, to make artistic designs, to work in wood." The priest placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder. "The work of your hands, done with faithfulness and skill and offered to God, is as sacred as any other work. The question is never, is my trade important enough? The question is, am I faithful with what God has placed in my hands?" Tobias felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you, Father. Go in peace, my son, and know that when you return to your workshop, you are entering your own temple, your own place of offering." That night, Tobias barely slept, not from restlessness, but from a kind of excited stillness, as though something fundamental had shifted and his body and soul needed time to adjust to the new alignment. On the morning of the third day, he woke, knowing it was time to leave Jerusalem. He attended the morning prayers one last time, said a quiet farewell to the city that had given him so much, and gathered his few belongings. Before leaving, he made one more visit to the teaching courts, hoping to see Rabbi Eleazar again. The old man was there, deep in discussion with several students about a passage from Isaiah. When he saw Tobias, he smiled and beckoned him over. "You are leaving?" the rabbi asked. "Yes, Rabbi. It is time to go home." "And have you found what you were seeking?" Tobias considered the question. "I think I have found that the seeking itself was what I needed, and I have found that the answers I was looking for were not information, but transformation." "Well spoken," Eleazar said. "Then you are ready to begin the real work. Remember, Tobias, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. not always in the ways you expect, but always in the ways that matter. They embraced, and Tobias felt the blessing of the old man like a tangible thing, a weight of approval and hope. "One more thing," the rabbi said as Tobias turned to go, "a proverb to carry with you. The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. Your father, your community, the work of your hands, these are the buckets by which God will draw out the purposes He has placed deep within you. Trust the process." Tobias walked through the streets of Jerusalem one last time, taking in the sights and sounds and smells, imprinting them on his memory. Then he passed through the gate and onto the road that led west, back toward the hills of Judah, back toward home. The journey back was different from the journey there. The same road, the same hills, even many of the same travelers. But Tobias himself was different, and so the world appeared different through his new eyes. He walked with a lighter step, not because his questions were all answered, but because he understood now that certainty was not the goal. Faithfulness was the goal. Obedience, openness, trust. On the first day of his return journey, he stopped at midday to rest under a fig tree. He was eating bread and dates when he heard voices, a man and woman arguing in low, tense tones. He looked up and saw a couple sitting not far away, their faces drawn with worry. Something in him hesitated. It would be easier to simply finish his meal and continue walking, to mind his own business. But he remembered Rabbi Eleazar's words, "Pay attention to the doors that open." He stood and approached them carefully. "Forgive me," he said. "I do not mean to intrude, but you seem troubled. Is there anything I might do to help?" The man looked up, his face suspicious at first, then softening. "You are kind to ask, friend, but I do not know that anyone can help. We are traveling to Bethlehem to my wife's family. Our cart broke an axle yesterday, and we had to abandon it. We lost most of our belongings, and—" He gestured to his wife's swollen belly. "She is with child, and I fear the walking is too much for her." Tobias knelt to examine the woman. She was pale, her breathing shallow, not in immediate danger, but clearly exhausted beyond what was healthy. "How far to Bethlehem?" he asked. "Perhaps 3 hours' walk from here," the man said. "But at the pace we can manage, I do not know." Tobias thought for a moment, then made a decision. "Stay here, in the shade. Rest. I saw a village perhaps an hour back the way I came. They have donkeys there, I remember seeing them. I will go back and arrange for one to be brought here. Your wife can ride the rest of the way." "But we have no money," the man said, his voice breaking. "The cart was my livelihood. All we have left is what we carry." "Then I will pay for it," Tobias said simply. "I have some coin saved. It is a gift freely given." The woman began to cry, tears of relief and gratitude. Her husband gripped Tobias's hand. "May the Lord bless you and keep you, friend. May His face shine upon you." Tobias walked back the way he had come, and it took him nearly 2 hours to reach the village, arrange for a donkey and a boy to lead it, and return to the couple. By then the afternoon was waning, but the joy on the couple's faces when the donkey arrived made every step worth it. "What is your name?" the man asked as he helped his wife onto the donkey. "Tobias, from Beth Shemesh." "I am Ephraim, and this is my wife Ruth. We will not forget your kindness, Tobias. If ever you come to Bethlehem, ask for us. You will always have a place at our table." As Tobias watched them continue down the road, the woman comfortable on the donkey, the husband walking beside her with renewed hope in his eyes, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "This," he thought, "this is what it means to be faithful. Not grand gestures or perfect plans, but simply paying attention and responding with love when the opportunity presents itself. He made camp that night in the same grove of oak trees where he had slept on his journey to Jerusalem. But this time, the darkness held no uncertainty. He lay on his back, looking up at the stars through the branches, and prayed words that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Thank you, Lord, for this journey. Thank you for the restlessness that brought me seeking. Thank you for the teachers who spoke wisdom. Thank you for the opportunity to serve today. I do not know what tomorrow holds, or next week, or next year, but I commit my works to you. My hands, my skills, my time, my very life, all of it is yours. Use me as you will. Shape through me what you desire, and help me to be faithful in the small things, trusting that you are weaving all things into a pattern I cannot yet see. Sleep came easily, deeply, and his dreams were peaceful. He reached Beth Shemesh in the afternoon of the following day. As he crested the last hill and saw his village spread before him, he felt a surge of emotion. This small place, these familiar houses, this simple community, it was home. And home, he now understood, was holy ground. His father was in the workshop when Tobias entered the courtyard. The old man looked up from his work, and his face transformed with joy. He set down his tools and came forward quickly, embracing his son. Tobias, my son, you have returned. Yes, Abba, I have returned. Joachim held him at arm's length, studying his face. And you are different. I can see it in your eyes. I am, Tobias said. I do not know if I can explain it all, but I have learned things, important things. Then come, his father said. Let us eat together, and you will tell me everything. They sat in the courtyard as the afternoon light turned golden, sharing bread and olive oil and goat cheese. Tobias told his father about the journey, about Rabbi Eleazar and the priest and the couple on the road. He spoke of the questions he had asked and the answers he had received, not neat, packaged answers, but living truth that would continue to unfold. His father listened with the attention that was his gift, nodding occasionally, asking a question here and there, but mostly just receiving his son's words like precious gifts. When Tobias finished, Joachim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You asked what it means to commit your work to the Lord, and you have discovered that it means more than you thought. But let me add one thing, something I learned from my father, and he from his. He stood and gestured for Tobias to follow him into the workshop. The half-finished cabinet still sat on the workbench, exactly as Tobias had left it. Every piece of work, Joachim said, running his hand over the smooth wood, begins with a choice. Will I work for myself, or will I work for God? Will I work for praise, or will I work for faithfulness? Will I work to make a name for myself, or will I work to serve? He turned to his son. And here is the beautiful secret. When you choose to work for God, the work itself becomes better, not because you are trying harder, but because you are working with the grain of the universe, with the pattern God has woven into creation. You are cooperating with something larger than yourself. Tobias looked at the cabinet with new eyes. I want to finish it, he said, but differently than I began it. May I? Of course, my son. It is your work. Tobias stood before the workbench, placed his hands on the wood, and prayed. Not a quick blessing, but a real conversation. Lord, this cabinet, I offer it to you, not for my glory, but for yours. May it serve its purpose well. May it bring order and beauty into the home where it will reside. May the elder who commissioned it be blessed by its use, and may the making of it be an act of worship, a small offering of faithfulness. Then he picked up his tools and began to work. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Tobias rose each morning and began with prayer, not rushing through the words, but dwelling in them, letting them orient his heart. Then he went to the workshop, and before starting each task, he took a moment to consciously offer the work to God. At first it felt awkward, artificial, but gradually it became natural, like breathing. And something unexpected happened. The work itself felt different, more satisfying, more meaningful. He found himself paying attention to details he might have glossed over before, taking time to do things right rather than rushing to finish, choosing beauty over expediency when both were possible. The cabinet was finished within 2 weeks. When the elder came to collect it, he walked around it slowly, running his hands over the joints, opening and closing the doors, examining the interior shelves. He paused, searching for words. This is extraordinary work, Tobias. I have seen cabinets you have made before, and they were always good. But there is something different about this one. I cannot explain it, but I can feel it. Tobias smiled. I made it with a different heart than before, Uncle. That is all. Whatever you did, the elder said, keep doing it. This is the work of a true master. After the elder left, carrying the cabinet with the help of his sons, Joachim came into the workshop. Father and son looked at each other, and no words were needed. The old man nodded once, slowly, approvingly, and Tobias felt a swell of gratitude, not pride, but humble thankfulness. Word spread through the village about the cabinet, and new commissions began to arrive. A wealthy merchant from a nearby town wanted a dining table. A young couple requested a bridal chest. The synagogue needed repairs to the platform where the Torah was read. Each project Tobias approached with the same spirit. Prayer first, then careful planning, then patient execution. And each piece seemed to carry something intangible, a quality that people noticed even if they could not name it. But it was not all smooth. There were still frustrations. Wood that split despite his careful work. Customers who changed their minds midway through a project. Days when his hands ached and his back protested, and he felt more like giving up than pressing on. On one such day, perhaps 2 months after his return from Jerusalem, Tobias was struggling with a particularly difficult joint. The wood was hard, the angle awkward, and he had already made 2 mistakes that required him to start over. His patience was worn thin. He set down his tools harder than necessary and walked out into the courtyard, his jaw clenched with frustration. His father was there, tending his late wife's garden, and he looked up at the sound of Tobias's footsteps. "The work is not going well?" Joachim asked mildly. "The work is going terribly," Tobias said. "I keep making mistakes. The wood is fighting me at every turn, and I am supposed to have this finished by tomorrow." His father nodded slowly. "Come, sit with me." They sat on the low wall that bordered the garden, and Joachim was quiet for a moment, just looking at his flowers and herbs. Then he said, "Do you remember what you told me when you returned from Jerusalem? About committing your work to the Lord?" "Yes, Abba." "And do you remember what Rabbi Eleazar taught you? That when your plans are established by the Lord, it does not mean everything will go according to your design." Tobias felt a prickle of recognition. "Yes. So perhaps," his father said gently, "this frustration, these mistakes, perhaps they are part of the work too. Perhaps God is teaching you something through them. Patience, maybe, or humility, or the understanding that perfection is not always possible, and that is acceptable. But the customer expects your best work," Joachim interrupted. "Not perfect work, your best. And sometimes your best includes acknowledging that a project is more difficult than you anticipated and asking for more time. There is no shame in honesty. Tobias sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I am trying to control what I cannot control. I am working against the wood instead of with it. And I am working from pride, not wanting to admit that I need more time, rather than from faithfulness." "These are good realizations," his father said. "Now go back to the workshop. But before you pick up your tools, pray again. Surrender the outcome again. Remember that your worth is not in completing this project perfectly and on time, but in being faithful to the process, whatever that requires." Tobias did as his father suggested. He returned to the workshop, knelt beside the workbench, and prayed. Not eloquent words, just honest ones. "Lord, I am struggling. I am frustrated and tired and worried. I am trying to work for you, but I keep falling into old patterns of working for my own pride. Help me. Show me what I need to see. And if this project needs more time, give me the courage to ask for it." When he stood and looked at the joint again, he saw something he had missed before. The angle he had been trying to cut was not actually necessary. There was a simpler way, one that would be just as strong and would work with the grain of the wood rather than against it. He almost laughed, of course. He had been so fixed on his original plan that he had not been open to a better way. He made the adjustment, and the work proceeded smoothly. The joint came together beautifully, strong, and clean. And when he delivered the piece to the customer on time, the man was delighted. Seasons changed. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter. The rains came, turning the hills green again. Then spring arrived, and with it, Passover. Tobias made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem again, this time with his father. The old man was slower now, and they took their time on the road, stopping often to rest. But Joachim's spirit was strong, and he delighted in everything. The wild flowers blooming along the path, the songs of pilgrims traveling together, the first sight of the temple gleaming in the distance. In Jerusalem, Tobias sought out Rabbi Eleazar. The old man was frailer than he had been a year before, but his mind was sharp and his welcome warm. "Tobias," he exclaimed, "from Beth Shemesh, you have returned." "I have, Rabbi, and I brought my father to meet you." The two old men regarded each other with the instant recognition of kindred spirits. They fell into easy conversation, trading proverbs and insights, laughing at shared observations about human nature and God's humor. Later, when they were alone, Rabbi Eleazar asked Tobias, "And have you continued to walk the path, to commit your works to the Lord?" "I have tried, Rabbi. Some days better than others. I have learned that it is a daily practice, not a one-time decision." "Yes," Eleazar said, his eyes bright. "This is wisdom. And have you found that your plans are being established?" Tobias considered. "Not in the ways I expected. I am still a carpenter, still in my father's workshop, still in my small village. But the work feels different, and I feel different doing it. I am learning to see God in the small things, in the daily rhythms, in the simple act of doing my work with faithfulness." "Then your plans are being established indeed," the rabbi said. "Not all callings look dramatic from the outside. Most do not. Most of us are called to faithfulness in the ordinary, to bringing light into small corners, to doing our daily work as an offering. This is not less significant than the work of priests and prophets. It is the foundation on which everything else rests." He placed his hand on Tobias's head in blessing. "The Lord has set you on a good path, my son. Continue walking it, and remember, the journey is long, and the landscape will change many times. But the one who guides your steps is faithful. and he will complete the work he has begun in you. Tobias and his father returned to Beth Shemesh after the festival, and life continued in its rhythms. But Tobias found that he was no longer restless. The stone in his chest that had troubled him for so long had transformed into something else, not gone, but changed. Where there had been anxious uncertainty, there was now peaceful expectancy, a sense that his life was unfolding according to a pattern he could not fully see but could trust was good. He continued his work as a carpenter, and his reputation grew. People came from farther away to commission pieces from him, drawn by reports of his craftsmanship. But he was careful not to take on more work than he could do well. He remembered the lesson of the difficult joint, the temptation to overcommit from pride. He also began to take on apprentices, young men from the village who wanted to learn the trade. He taught them not just the technical skills, how to measure and cut and join, but the deeper lessons about working with the wood's nature, about patience and attention, about seeing their work as an offering. One of his apprentices, a boy named Micah, who was perhaps 14, asked him one day, "Master Tobias, why do you pray before you work? The other craftsmen in the village do not do this." Tobias set down the plane he had been using and looked at the boy thoughtfully. "Come, sit with me a moment." They sat on a bench outside the workshop, and Tobias said, "Tell me, Micah, when you're working on a piece and things go well, the measurements are right, the joints fit perfectly, the wood cooperates, how do you feel?" "Proud, I suppose," Micah said. "Happy that I did good work. And when things go poorly, when you make mistakes, frustrated, angry at myself, sometimes I want to give up." "Yes," Tobias said. "I felt the same way once, but I have learned something. When I pray before I work, I am reminding myself that the work is not ultimately about me. It is about serving God through serving others. And when I remember that, then the good days become opportunities for gratitude rather than pride, and the difficult days become opportunities for growth rather than occasions for despair." He put his hand on Micah's shoulder. "I am not trying to make you feel guilty if you do not pray. Each person must walk their own path with God. But I am inviting you to consider that all work, even the work of your hands in this dusty workshop, can be sacred if you offer it with the right heart." Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you teach me how to pray like that?" "Of course," Tobias said, and his heart swelled with gratitude. The lessons he had learned were being passed on. The chain continued. Years passed. Joachim grew older, eventually laying down his tools and spending his days in the courtyard, tending his garden and reading the scriptures slowly, savoring each word. Tobias cared for him with tender devotion, remembering all the times his father had cared for him. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun set, Joachim said, "I am proud of you, my son, not because you have become a successful craftsman, though you have, but because you have become a faithful man. That is worth more than all the gold in Solomon's treasury." "You taught me, Abba," Tobias said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I know about faithfulness, I learned from watching you." "Perhaps," the old man said, "but you were willing to learn. That is a gift in itself. Many sons rebel against their father's teaching. You sought it out." They sat in companionable silence as the sky turned from gold to rose to deep purple. The first stars began to appear, one by one, like lamps being lit in distant windows. "Do you still feel the restlessness?" Joachim asked quietly. "That feeling that brought you to Jerusalem all those years ago?" Tobias considered. "No," he said finally. "Or rather, it has transformed. I am not restless anymore, but neither am I complacent. I am expectant, waiting to see what God will do next, trusting that whatever comes, it will be good. That is wisdom, his father said, the wisdom of a heart that has learned to rest in God's sovereignty. When Joachim died peacefully in his sleep the following winter, Tobias mourned deeply, but he did not mourn as one without hope. He buried his father in the family tomb outside the village, wrapped in clean linen according to custom, and he sat Shiva for the prescribed days. Friends and neighbors came to comfort him, bringing food and prayers, and Tobias received them with grace, finding that in ministering to others' need to comfort, he himself was comforted. On the 7th day after the burial, Tobias returned to the workshop. It was early morning, the air still cool and fresh. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the space that had been his father's domain for so many decades. The tools hung on their pegs, each in its place. The workbench bore the marks of countless projects, grooves worn smooth by years of use. Sawdust lay in the corners, fine as powder, smelling of cedar and olive wood. He walked to his father's favorite spot, near the window where the morning light fell most clearly. There, leaning against the wall, was a piece of wood Joachim had been shaping in his final weeks, a walking stick carved with intricate patterns. The old man's hands had grown too weak to finish it, but the intention was clear in every line. Tobias picked it up, feeling the smoothness where his father's hands had worked, the roughness where the work remained undone, and he understood, with a clarity that needed no words, that this was the pattern of all life. We begin things we cannot finish. We plant seeds we will not see harvested. We shape wood that other hands will complete. I will finish this, Abba, he whispered to the empty workshop, and I will teach others to finish what I cannot complete. The work continues. He set the walking stick aside carefully and began his morning ritual. First, prayer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept me alive, sustained me, and brought me to this season. Then he examined his tools, selecting the ones he would need for the day's work. A merchant from a distant town had commissioned a chest for his daughter's wedding, and Tobias had planned it carefully. Cypress wood for the body, cedar for the lining, brass hinges he had traded for from a metal worker in Jerusalem. But before he began the chest, he picked up his father's walking stick again. 1 hour, he said to himself. 1 hour for this, then the commissioned work. He worked slowly, thoughtfully, letting his hands remember the patterns his father had started. The stick was meant to have a shepherd's crook at the top, and below it a series of carved vines. Joachim had completed the crook and begun the first tendrils of vine. Tobias studied the pattern, then selected his finest carving knife and continued where his father had left off. As he worked, memory washed over him like a gentle tide. He remembered being 8 years old, watching his father shape a yoke for their neighbor's ox. The concentration on Joachim's face, the sureness of his movements, the way he would pause occasionally to run his hand over the wood, reading it like a text. Feel the grain, Tobias, his father had said. The wood will tell you where it wants to go. But wood cannot speak, Abba, cannot it? Joachim had smiled. Then you are not listening carefully enough. Everything God created has its own language. The wood speaks in the direction of its grain, in the hardness and softness of its substance, in the way it receives the blade. Learn to listen, and you will never force the wood against its nature. Now, carving the walking stick, Tobias listened. He felt where the knife wanted to go, where the wood yielded easily, and where it resisted. He worked with it, not against it, and the vine pattern grew beneath his hands, curling and twining as if it had always been waiting there, hidden in the cypress, needing only to be revealed. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, warming the workshop. Micah arrived. He was nearly 18 now, no longer a boy, but a young man, skilled in his own right. He stopped in the doorway, seeing Tobias at work on the walking stick. "May I help, master?" Micah asked quietly. Tobias looked up, surprised to find so much time had passed. Then he nodded. "Yes, come. I will do the carving, but the stick needs sanding and oiling. Your hands are younger and stronger than mine." They worked together in companionable silence, and Tobias found himself thinking about succession, about passing on not just skills, but wisdom, not just techniques, but spirit. Micah had grown not only in craft, but in character. He was patient with difficult work, generous with his time when someone needed help, and he had begun to pray before working, as Tobias did. "Micah," Tobias said as they worked, "do you remember when you first asked me why I pray before I work?" "Yes, master. I was perhaps 14. You told me about seeing work as an offering to God. And have you found this to be true in your own experience?" Micah paused in his sanding, considering. "I have, master. At first, I prayed because you did, because I wanted to be like you. But over time, something changed. I began to feel, I do not know how to describe it, as though my hands were not entirely my own, as though I was partnering with something larger than myself." "Yes," Tobias said, his voice warm with approval. "That is exactly right. You are learning what cannot be taught, only experienced." They finished the walking stick by midday. It was beautiful, functional, but also a work of art, the kind of piece that would be treasured and passed down through generations. Tobias held it up to the light, examining it from all angles, and felt his father's presence so strongly it was almost tangible. "It is finished, Abba," he whispered. "You began it, and I completed it, as it should be." He set the walking stick in the corner of the workshop, in a place of honor, where it would remain, not to be sold or given away, but kept as a reminder of continuity, of the chain that stretched back through the generations and forward into the future. Then he turned to the commissioned chest and began that work, Micah helping him. They measured and marked, cut and planed, fitted and adjusted. The cypress wood was good quality, straight-grained and fragrant. As they worked, Tobias found himself teaching Micah not just the technical aspects, but the deeper principles. "See how we are building this chest?" he said. "Strong corners, tight joints, smooth finish. But why? Yes, the customer wants quality. But more than that, this chest will hold this young woman's treasures. Perhaps her wedding garments, perhaps gifts for her future children, perhaps letters from her mother. We are not just building a box. We are creating a vessel for memory, for love, for legacy." "So every project is sacred?" Micah asked. "Every project can be sacred," Tobias corrected, "if we approach it with the right heart. If we remember that our work serves others, and in serving others, we serve God. A poorly made chest is not just bad craftsmanship. It is a failure of love." The afternoon deepened into evening. They lit lamps when the natural light began to fail and continued working. At some point, Tobias's neighbor, Sarah, brought them food, bread and lentil stew, olives and cheese. She was a widow herself now, her husband having died 2 years prior, and she and Tobias had developed a quiet friendship, born of shared grief and mutual respect. "You work too late," she said, setting the food on a cleared space on the workbench. "You will damage your eyes." "We are nearly finished with this section," Tobias replied. "But thank you, Sarah." Will you eat with us?" She hesitated, then nodded. They sat together, Tobias, Micah, and Sarah, eating the simple meal and talking of small things. The weather, the upcoming festival, news from Jerusalem. But beneath the simple conversation, Tobias felt something he had not felt in many months, the possibility of new beginnings, even in the midst of endings. After Sarah left, and Micah had gone home to his own family, Tobias remained in the workshop, not working, but simply sitting, letting the silence settle around him. The lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of wood and oil and smoke filled the air. This space, this workshop, was holy ground, not because it was set apart for religious ritual, but because it was where he practiced faithfulness daily, where he offered the work of his hands as worship. He thought about his journey to Jerusalem, which now seemed both very long ago and very recent. The restlessness that had driven him to seek answers had been transformed through time and experience and God's patient shaping into something else. Not complacency, but peace. Not the absence of questions, but the comfort of knowing that questions were acceptable, even necessary. Rabbi Eleazar's words came back to him. The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. "What are the purposes you have placed in my heart, Lord?" Tobias prayed into the quiet workshop. "I thought once that I needed to leave this place to become something different, to do something grand. But you have taught me that there is no small work when it is done with great love. You have taught me that faithfulness in the ordinary is the foundation of all that is extraordinary." He sat in silence, listening, not for a voice. He had learned that God rarely spoke in voices, but for the quiet knowing that came from being still, from being present, from being open. And what came to him was not a dramatic revelation, but a gentle unfolding of understanding. He saw his life not as a single linear path, but as a tree with many branches. His work as a carpenter was one branch. His teaching of apprentices was another. His friendship with Sarah might become yet another. His participation in the community, his prayers, his daily acts of kindness, each was a branch, and together they formed something larger than any single part. "I am not meant to do one great thing," he whispered. "I am meant to do many small things with great faithfulness, and you will weave them all together into a pattern I cannot yet see." The seasons turned again. Spring came, bringing the rains that made the hills green and dotted them with wildflowers. Tobias and Sarah's friendship deepened slowly, cautiously. Two people who had known loss learning to open their hearts again. They would walk together in the evening sometimes after the day's work was done, talking of their memories and their hopes. One evening, as they sat on a low stone wall overlooking the valley, Sarah said, "Do you ever think about remarrying, Tobias?" The question hung in the air between them. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the western hills. "I do," he said finally, "but I am afraid of forgetting, afraid of, I do not even know what I am afraid of. Forgetting your father? In a way. I never married when he was alive. I was always here, helping him, caring for him, continuing the work. My whole identity was bound up in being Joachim's son, Joachim's apprentice, Joachim's partner. Now that he is gone, I do not entirely know who I am." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand. When my husband died, I felt as though I had lost myself along with him. I was Reuben's wife. Without him, who was I?" She paused. "But I have learned something. We are not defined only by our relationships to others, even the most important relationships. We are defined by our relationship to God. Everything else flows from that. You sound like Rabbi Eleazar, Tobias said with a gentle smile. Then he is a wise man. Tobias, you are not just Joachim's son. You are Tobias, son of God, beloved and chosen, gifted with skilled hands and a faithful heart. Your father's death does not erase who you are. It reveals who you are becoming. They sat together as the darkness deepened and the first stars appeared. Tobias felt something shifting in his chest, not the old restlessness, but something new. Hope, perhaps, or courage, or simply the willingness to step forward into the unknown, trusting that God would continue to guide his steps. Over the following months, Tobias and Sarah's relationship grew from friendship into something deeper. They were not young and passionate, but mature and careful. Two people who understood the weight of commitment and the value of companionship. They talked about everything, their losses, their fears, their faith, their dreams for whatever years remained to them. One Sabbath evening, after the synagogue service, Tobias walked Sarah home. At her door, he took her hand and said, "Sarah, I would like to speak with your father, with your permission." She looked at him, her eyes bright with tears that could have been joy or fear or both. "You have my permission, Tobias, and my heart, if you want it." "I do want it," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, not to replace what we have lost, but to create something new, to honor our past by living fully in the present." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony attended by the whole village. The synagogue was full of people who had known them both all their lives, who had mourned with them and now rejoiced with them. The rabbi who officiated spoke of Ruth and Boaz, of second chances, of God's kindness that never ends. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this season." Tobias prayed under the chuppah, and he meant every word with his whole being. Sarah moved into his house, bringing with her the things she treasured, her late husband's prayer shawl, which she gave to Tobias with blessing, her mother's oil lamps, her own skill with herbs and healing. Together, they made the house a home again. She tended the garden Joachim had kept, adding her own plants and flowers. Tobias expanded the workshop slightly, creating a space where Sarah could dry herbs and prepare medicines. They fell into rhythms of shared life, morning prayers together, simple meals, evening walks, Sabbaths filled with rest and study and the joy of community. They did not have children. They were both past that season, but they had Micah and other young people in the village who looked to them for guidance. One day, perhaps a year after their marriage, a stranger came to the village. He was well dressed, clearly a man of means, traveling with servants and pack animals. He asked for Tobias the carpenter, and when he was brought to the workshop, he introduced himself. "I am Ephraim," he said, "from Bethlehem. I do not know if you remember, but many years ago on the road, you helped my wife and me. You paid for a donkey when we had no money, when Ruth was with child and could not walk farther." Tobias stared at him, memory flooding back. The exhausted couple, the pregnant woman, the walk back to find help. "I remember," he said. "How is Ruth and the child?" Ephraim's face lit up. "Ruth is well, and the child, our son, is now 12 years old, strong and healthy. We named him Tobias after you. We have never forgotten your kindness." He gestured to his servants, who brought forward a large bundle. "I have prospered in my business. God has blessed me greatly, and I want to bless you in return. This is Lebanese cedar, the finest I could find. I want you to make something with it, whatever you wish. Consider it payment for a debt I can never fully repay." Tobias was overwhelmed. The cedar was extraordinary, close-grained, fragrant, without flaw. It was worth a small fortune. Ephraim, this is too much. I did not help you expecting payment. I know, Ephraim said. That is precisely why I want to give it. You helped us because it was right, because you saw people in need and responded. That is the kind of man you are. Please accept this gift and come to Bethlehem sometime. Meet young Tobias. Let us show you the hospitality you showed us. After Ephraim left, Tobias stood in his workshop, looking at the cedar, and he wept, not from sadness, but from gratitude. He had given a simple kindness years ago and had forgotten about it, expecting nothing. And now it had returned to him 100-fold. That night he told Sarah the story, and she listened with shining eyes. "What will you make with such wood?" she asked. "I do not know yet," Tobias said. "I need to pray about it. Wood this precious should be used for something worthy." He spent several days in contemplation and prayer. The cedar sat in the workshop, waiting. Micah and the other apprentices would come and touch it reverently, marveling at its quality. But Tobias did not rush. He had learned that the best work came not from haste, but from patience, not from his own clever planning, but from surrendering the process to God. Then, one morning during his prayers, clarity came. He would make a cabinet for the synagogue, a place to store the Torah scrolls. It would be the finest work he had ever done, crafted from this gift of cedar, and it would serve the community for generations. It would be his legacy, but more importantly, it would be his offering. He began the work with ceremony. He invited the rabbi and the elders of the village to the workshop. They prayed together, dedicating the project. May this wood, which grew in Lebanon's mountains, which was given in gratitude, which will be shaped by these hands, become a dwelling place for your word, O Lord. May it serve your people faithfully. May all who see it remember that every good gift comes from you. The work took months. Tobias worked slowly, carefully, bringing all his skill and experience to bear. He carved the doors with intricate patterns, the tree of life, grapevines, pomegranates, all the symbols of God's abundance. He crafted the interior with perfect joints and smooth surfaces. He treated the wood with oils that would preserve it for centuries. Micah worked alongside him, learning, helping, growing in his own skill. They would often work in silence. The only sounds the whisper of plane on wood, the soft tap of mallet on chisel, the rustle of sawdust falling. One afternoon, as they worked, Micah said, "Master, may I ask you something?" "Of course. You have taught me carpentry. You have taught me to pray before I work. You have taught me to see each project as service. But there is something else I see in you, something I cannot quite name. A peace, perhaps, a settledness. How does one attain this?" Tobias set down his tools and looked at his apprentice, this young man who had become like a son to him. "Micah, what I am going to tell you is the most important thing I have learned in my life, more important than any technique or skill. Are you listening?" "Yes, Master." "The peace you see is not something I attained. It is something I received. For years, I tried to figure out my life on my own. I made plans. I worried about the future. I felt restless and uncertain. Then I made a journey to Jerusalem seeking answers. And what I learned there was not information, but transformation." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I learned that God's love for us is not dependent on our accomplishments or our plans. His love simply is like the sun shining, whether we acknowledge it or not. And when we truly grasp this, not just with our minds, but with our hearts, everything changes. We stop working to prove our worth and start working from our worth. We stop trying to earn God's favor and start responding to favor already given. But how does one grasp this? Micah asked. By living it day by day, by committing each work to Him, by trusting when the wood splits and the plans change, by seeing each difficulty as an opportunity to deepen faith rather than as evidence of failure, by remembering every single day that we are held by a love that will not let us go. Micah was quiet, absorbing this. Then he said, "Will you teach me this, as you have taught me carpentry?" Tobias smiled. "I will teach you what I can, but mostly you will learn by living, by staying faithful through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, by choosing to trust even when trust is difficult, by doing your work, whatever it is, as an offering of love." They returned to their work on the cabinet, but something had shifted. Micah worked with new intentionality, new presence, and Tobias gave thanks for this opportunity to pass on not just skill but wisdom, not just technique but truth. The cabinet was completed in the late summer. It was magnificent. Everyone who saw it agreed. The cedar glowed with a warm golden light. The carvings were intricate but not ostentatious, beautiful but functional. The doors opened and closed with perfect smoothness. The interior was fitted precisely to hold the Torah scrolls safely. On the day they dedicated it, the entire village gathered at the synagogue. The rabbi led prayers of blessing. The scrolls were processed ceremonially and placed in their new home. Songs were sung, psalms recited. It was a day of celebration. But for Tobias, the most meaningful moment came quietly, later, when everyone had gone home. He stood alone in the synagogue, in the dimming light of late afternoon, looking at the cabinet. He placed his hand on the wood, feeling its warmth, its smoothness, the result of months of careful work. "Abba," he whispered, addressing both his earthly father and his heavenly one, "this is my offering, not perfect, because nothing human is perfect, but faithful, done with love, shaped by the gifts you gave me. May it serve well, may it last long, and may all who see it remember your faithfulness." He felt in that moment a fullness that he had rarely experienced, not the fullness of completion, but the fullness of having poured himself into something larger than himself, not the satisfaction of achievement, but the deep joy of obedience. Walking home in the twilight, he saw Sarah waiting for him at their door. She had prepared a special meal to celebrate. As they ate together, she said, "You look content, husband?" "I am," he said. "I have done the work I was given to do in the way I was meant to do it. I have committed it to the Lord, and whatever comes of it is His concern, not mine." "This is wisdom," Sarah said. "And peace." "Yes," Tobias agreed, "both wisdom and peace." Years continued to pass. Tobias grew older, his hair turning silver, his back developing the permanent curve of one who has spent a lifetime bent over workbenches. But his hands remained steady, his eyes clear, his heart at peace. He trained other apprentices after Micah. Some went on to become skilled craftsmen themselves. Others left carpentry for different trades, but they carried with them the lessons he had taught about faithfulness, about seeing work as worship, about trusting in God's providence. Sarah's health began to fail in their 10th year together. It was gradual. First a cough that would not leave, then growing weakness, then days when she could not leave her bed. Tobias cared for her with tender devotion, setting aside his work when necessary, sitting with her for hours, reading scripture, praying, simply being present. One afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, she took his hand and said, "Tobias, I want to thank you." "For what, beloved?" "For giving me these years, for seeing me not as Reuben's widow, but as Sarah, for building a life with me, for showing me that God's goodness does not end when we think it should. It is I who should thank you, Tobias said, his voice thick. You taught me that my father's death was not the end of love, that hearts could open again, that new chapters could begin even when we thought the book was finished. We have been blessed, Sarah whispered. We have, Tobias agreed. She died peacefully 3 days later, on a Sabbath morning, with Tobias holding her hand. He buried her beside his father in the family tomb, and once again he mourned, but once again not as one without hope. At the Shiva, many people came. They shared memories of Sarah, her kindness, her wisdom, her skill with healing herbs. They comforted Tobias, and he received their comfort with grace. And through it all, he felt beneath the grief a foundation of peace, the same peace he had found years before in Jerusalem, the peace that came from knowing himself held by a love greater than loss. Because Tobias was now an old man, his joints ached on cold mornings. His eyes grew tired more quickly than they once had, but his spirit remained strong, his faith unshaken. He still worked, though less intensely. He took only small projects now, things he could complete without strain. A toy for a child, a simple stool, repairs to household items. Each piece still received his full attention, his prayers, his care. Micah had fully taken over the workshop, and he now had apprentices of his own. The chain continued. The work went on. One spring morning, Tobias decided to make another pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He was perhaps 70 years old now, and he knew this might be his last opportunity to see the holy city again. Micah wanted to come with him, and together they made the journey, taking their time, stopping often to rest. The road was familiar to Tobias, though much had changed. New villages had grown up. Old landmarks had disappeared, but the hills remained the same. The sky the same blue, the wildflowers the same colors. They reached Jerusalem on the second day, just as Tobias had calculated all those decades ago. The city had grown, become more crowded, more cosmopolitan. Roman presence was even more evident than before, but the temple still stood at the city's heart, still drew pilgrims from across the world. Tobias made his way to the teaching courts, wondering if Rabbi Eleazar might still be there. But the old rabbi had died years ago, he was told. In his place were younger teachers, continuing the tradition of study and debate. Tobias stood at the edge of one such group, listening to their discussion. They were debating a passage from Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. One young student said, "But Rabbi, how can we not lean on our understanding? God gave us minds to think. Is it not an insult to him to refuse to use them?" The teacher, a man perhaps 40 years old, smiled. "A good question. Who here can answer it?" Tobias found himself speaking, surprising himself. "If I may, Rabbi?" The teacher gestured for him to continue. "Please, grandfather. Wisdom is welcome from all sources. The proverb does not say, 'Do not use your understanding,'" Tobias said. "It says, 'Do not lean on your understanding.' There is a difference. To use our understanding is good and necessary. God did give us minds, and he expects us to use them. But to lean on our understanding, to trust in it ultimately to make it our foundation, this is folly, because our understanding is limited, finite, prone to error. We should use our minds, but we should lean on God. We should think and plan and reason, but we should trust not in our reasoning, but in the one who guides it." The teacher nodded appreciatively. "Well said, grandfather. And have you learned this through experience?" "I have, Rabbi. Many years ago, I came to this city seeking answers to questions I could not resolve. I was trying to figure out my life through my own wisdom, and I was failing. A wise teacher taught me then to commit my works to the Lord, to surrender my plans while still making plans, to trust in God's direction even as I chose my steps. This teaching has guided my whole life since. And has it proven true? The young student asked. Every day, Tobias said simply. Every single day. After the discussion ended, the teacher approached Tobias. Grandfather, thank you for sharing. Your words carried the weight of lived truth. Will you be in Jerusalem long? A few days, perhaps. Then please come to my home for a meal. I would hear more of your story. Tobias accepted, and that evening he found himself in the teacher's house, a simple but comfortable dwelling near the Temple Mount. The teacher's name was Judah, and he had a wife and 3 young children. They ate together, and Tobias told them of his journey decades ago, of Rabbi Eleazar, of all he had learned. I am grateful, Judah said, that you shared this with my students today. So many young people today are anxious, uncertain. The world is changing rapidly. Roman rule grows heavier. There is talk of rebellion. Many feel lost. They need to hear from those who have found peace, who have learned to trust. I was one of those anxious young people once, Tobias said. I understand their struggle, but I also know that the answer is the same in every generation. Surrender to God, faithfulness in the present moment, trust in His larger purposes. He stayed several more days in Jerusalem, and each day he returned to the teaching courts. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he spoke. Always he prayed, soaking in the atmosphere of the holy city, feeling the weight of centuries of faith. On his last morning, he rose before dawn and climbed to a spot on the Mount of Olives where he could see the entire city spread before him. Micah came with him, and they stood together in the cool morning air, watching as the sun rose and painted the temple gold. Master, Micah said quietly, what are you thinking? I am thinking about circles, Tobias said. How I stood in this very spot, or one like it, when I was 20 years old, full of questions and restlessness. And now I stand here again, 70 years old, and the questions are answered not with words, but with a life lived. I am thinking about how God has guided my steps, everyone, even when I could not see where I was going. Do you have any regrets? Micah asked. Tobias considered. I regret moments of impatience, times when I forgot to trust, days when I worked from pride rather than love, but overall, no. I have lived the life I was given, in the place I was given, with the gifts I was given. I have tried to be faithful. God has done the rest. They stood in silence as the city below came to life. The call to prayer echoed from the temple. Smoke from morning fires rose into the sky. The day began. Come, Tobias said. Let us go down one more time. I want to pray at the temple, to give thanks, to commit whatever days remain to me into God's hands. They descended into the city, and Tobias made his way to the court of Israel. He stood there, an old man among many worshipers, and he prayed, not elaborate prayers, but simple ones. Thank you. I trust you. Use me until my last breath. May my life have been a faithful offering. When he finished, he felt complete. Not that his life was over, but that it was whole. Whatever days remained would be gift, not obligation. He had run his race. He had kept the faith. He had built not just furniture, but a life that honored God. Shakyadias, the journey home, was slower than the journey there. Tobias's old bones protested the walking, but he did not mind. Each step was a prayer, each breath a thanksgiving. They stopped in Bethlehem, and Tobias asked directions to Ephraim's house. When they arrived, The greeting was joyful. Ephraim was gray-haired now himself, and young Tobias, named after the carpenter, was indeed 12, on the cusp of manhood. "Uncle Tobias!" the boy exclaimed, for so he had been taught to call the man who had helped his parents. "I have heard so many stories about you." They stayed for 2 days, and Tobias delighted in the boy's energy and curiosity. Young Tobias peppered him with questions about carpentry, about Jerusalem, about everything, and Tobias answered patiently, seeing in this boy's eagerness an echo of his own younger self. On the second evening, as they prepared to leave, young Tobias said, "Uncle, will you bless me? My father says you are a man who knows God." Tobias placed his hands on the boy's head, feeling the familiar words rise up from somewhere deep within. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. May you grow in wisdom and stature. May you seek God with your whole heart. May you find your calling and pursue it faithfully. May you know yourself loved, held, guided always. Amen," Ephraim said, tears in his eyes. When Tobias and Micah finally reached Beth Shemesh, it was evening. The village looked exactly as it always had, small, humble, ordinary. But to Tobias, it was beautiful. This was where God had placed him. This was where he had learned to be faithful. This was home. He went to the workshop the next morning and stood in the doorway looking at the familiar space, the tools, the workbench, the smell of sawdust and oil, all unchanged, all exactly as they should be. Micah came to stand beside him. "What will you work on today, master?" Tobias thought. Then he remembered something. "There is a small project I have been meaning to do for years. A footstool for the synagogue, for the elderly who have trouble standing for long prayers. Nothing elaborate, just solid, simple, useful." They worked together that day, and Tobias found joy in the simplicity of it. No pressure, no grand design, just good wood, good tools, good company, good work. Over the following months, Tobias gradually transitioned fully into retirement. He would come to the workshop occasionally, but more as visitor than worker. He spent his days in prayer and study, in visiting the sick, in playing with neighborhood children, in sitting in the sun and giving thanks. One afternoon, a young woman from the village came to him. She was perhaps 18, on the verge of marriage, but her face was troubled. "Master Tobias," she said, "may I speak with you?" "Of course, child. What troubles you?" "I am to be married next month. My betrothed is a good man, a faithful man, but I am afraid. I do not know how to be a wife. I do not know if I will be adequate to the task. What if I fail?" Tobias smiled gently. "Come, sit with me." They sat in his small courtyard, in the shade of an olive tree. "Let me tell you something I learned when I was about your age, perhaps even younger in spirit than you are now. I was convinced that I needed to have everything figured out before I could truly live. I thought that if I could just understand my purpose, know my path with certainty, master my trade completely, then I would be ready. But life does not wait for us to feel ready, my child, and God does not require our perfection before he works through us." The young woman listened intently, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the old carpenter's weathered face. "When I was your age," Tobias continued, "I felt a restlessness I could not name. I thought perhaps I was in the wrong place, doing the wrong work, living the wrong life. So I made a journey to Jerusalem, seeking answers from the wise teachers there. And do you know what I learned?" "What, master?" "I learned that the question itself was wrong. I was asking, what should I do, when I should have been asking, how should I be? I was seeking a destination when God was inviting me into a way of walking. I was trying to figure out my life when God was asking me simply to trust Him with it. He reached down and picked up a small stone from the ground, smooth and gray, worn by countless rains. Look at this stone. It did not become smooth by planning to be smooth. It became smooth by allowing the water to flow over it, day after day, season after season. The water did the work. The stone simply remained faithful to its nature, solid, present, yielding to the process. So you are saying I should not try? Should not prepare? No, child, I am saying prepare your heart, not just your hands. Learn the skills of being a wife, yes, how to manage a household, how to prepare food, how to care for others. But more importantly, learn the deeper skills, how to listen with patience, how to speak with kindness even when tired, how to forgive quickly and love steadily, how to commit your works, even the smallest, most mundane works, to the Lord, and trust that He will establish what needs to be established. The young woman was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, "But what if I fail? What if I am not enough?" Tobias smiled, and in his smile was the wisdom of decades. "My dear child, you will fail many times. I failed as a son, as a carpenter, as a husband. I made mistakes. I spoke harshly when I should have been gentle. I worked from pride when I should have worked from love. But here is the beautiful secret. Our failures are not the end of the story. They are part of the story. God does not expect you to be perfect. He expects you to be faithful. And when you fail, not if, but when, you rise, you learn, you ask forgiveness, and you continue. This is how we grow." He stood slowly, his joints creaking with age, and gestured toward his workshop. "Do you see that building? I have worked there for more than 50 years, and do you know how many pieces I have ruined, how many measurements I have gotten wrong, how many times I have had to start over? Countless. But each mistake taught me something. Each failure deepened my skill. Each moment of having to begin again strengthened my patience." He turned back to her, his eyes warm with compassion. "Marriage is like this. It is a craft that you learn by doing, not by planning. Yes, go into it with intention and preparation, but also go into it with humility, knowing that you will learn more in the first month of marriage than in all the months of preparation. Go into it with commitment, determined that when difficulties come, and they will, you will not run, but will stay and work through them. And most importantly, go into it with trust in God, knowing that He who brought you and your husband together will be faithful to complete what He has begun." The young woman's eyes had filled with tears, but they were not tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of release. "Thank you, Master Tobias. You have given me peace." "I have given you nothing," Tobias said gently. "I have only reminded you of what you already knew in your deepest heart. Now go. Prepare for your wedding with joy, not anxiety. And remember, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans, even your marriage, will be established." After she left, Tobias sat again beneath the olive tree, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face. He thought about all the people who had come to him over the years, seeking counsel, asking questions, looking for wisdom, and each time he had simply tried to share what he himself had learned, that life was not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who did. The seasons continued to turn. Autumn came again, painting the hills in shades of amber and gold. The village prepared for the harvest, and there was joy in the air, the joy that comes from seeing the fruit of labor, from gathering what has been planted and tended. Tobias took walks each evening, his pace slower now, his steps more careful. But his eyes were as clear as ever, and he noticed everything. The way the light fell through the olive branches, the sound of children playing in the streets, the smell of bread baking in outdoor ovens, the faces of neighbors, some young, some old, all part of the tapestry of community that had held him all his life. One evening, as the sun was setting, he walked to the village square, where a group of young men were gathered, apprentices from various trades, talking and laughing. When they saw him, they fell respectfully quiet. "Master Tobias," one of them said, "will you sit with us? We were just discussing the teaching from the synagogue this morning about the Proverbs of Solomon." Tobias lowered himself onto the stone wall where they sat. "And what did you discuss?" The rabbi spoke about the verse, "The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out." "We are trying to understand what it means." Tobias nodded slowly. "A good verse to ponder. Tell me, what do you think it means?" The young men offered various answers, that we must seek wisdom from others, that we must study deeply, that we must pray for understanding. Each answer had truth in it, and Tobias acknowledged this. Then he said, "Let me add something to your good thoughts. I believe this proverb is telling us that God has placed purposes within each of us, callings, gifts, unique ways we are meant to serve and love and create. But these purposes are not always obvious. They are like water in a deep well. The well is there, the water is there, but we cannot simply wish the water to the surface. We must draw it out." "How do we draw it out?" one young man asked. "Through living," Tobias said simply. "Through faithful work, through relationships, through both joy and suffering, through prayer and obedience, and sometimes through failure. Each experience is like lowering the bucket into the well. Each lesson learned brings up a little more of the water. Over time, over years, we begin to understand what God has placed within us. We begin to see the patterns, the threads that run through our lives. We begin to know ourselves as God knows us." He looked at their young faces, so earnest, so full of questions. "You are at the beginning of this process. You will spend your whole lives drawing out these deep waters. Do not be impatient with yourselves. Do not compare your understanding to others. Each person's well is different, each person's water unique. Your task is simply to keep lowering the bucket, to keep paying attention, to keep living faithfully. And one day, perhaps when you are old like me, you will look back and see that God was revealing His purposes all along, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little." The young men sat in thoughtful silence as the last light faded from the sky. Then, one by one, they thanked him and went to their homes. Tobias remained a while longer, looking up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for a life lived in your presence, for work that had meaning, for relationships that shaped me, for this village that held me, for all the joys and all the sorrows, for they were all part of your shaping. I do not know how many days remain to me, but however many they are, let them be lived in faithfulness. Let them be offerings. Let them point others to you." Winter came quietly to Beth Shemesh that year. The rains fell gently, soaking into the earth, preparing it for spring. The days were short, the nights long, and people gathered around fires, telling stories, sharing meals, strengthening the bonds of community. Tobias spent much of the winter in his house, wrapped in his warmest cloak, reading from the scrolls of Scripture that he had collected over the years. His eyes were not as strong as they once were, but with the help of good light and patience, he could still make out the ancient words, and each word was like a friend, familiar and beloved. He read the Psalms often. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Yes, he thought, yes, this has been true, all of it. He read from Proverbs, the book his father had loved so well. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. The verse that had guided his whole life since that journey to Jerusalem so many years ago. He read from Ecclesiastes, finding in its honest appraisal of life a strange comfort. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. Yes, he was in the season of harvest now, the season of gathering in what had been sown, the season of preparing for the great rest that awaited all who labored. On the coldest nights, Micah would come and sit with him, and they would talk of many things, not just carpentry, though they spoke of that too, but of life, of faith, of the mysteries that never quite resolved, but somehow became less troubling with time. Master, Micah said one evening, you have lived a long life. What would you say is the most important thing you have learned? Tobias was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Then he said, that God is faithful. That is all. That is everything. In every season, in every circumstance, in joy and in sorrow, in success and in failure, in youth and in age, God has been faithful. Not always in the ways I expected, not always according to my timeline, but always, always faithful. And when I understood this, truly understood it not just in my mind, but in my bones, then I found peace. Because if God is faithful, then I do not need to be anxious. I simply need to be faithful in return, in whatever small ways I can, and trust that he is weaving everything into a pattern of good. Micah nodded slowly, absorbing this. And you have no regrets? Oh, I have regrets, Tobias said with a slight smile. I regret words spoken in anger that I cannot take back. I regret opportunities for kindness that I missed. I regret days when I worked from pride instead of from love. But I do not live in those regrets. I have confessed them, received forgiveness, learned from them, and moved forward. Regret can be a teacher if we let it, but it must not be a prison. The fire crackled and popped, sending up small showers of sparks. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Will you teach me one more thing? Micah asked. If I can, my son. Teach me how to grow old with grace, how to face the end without fear. Tobias looked at his former apprentice, now a master craftsman himself, and saw in him the earnestness that he remembered in his own young self. I am still learning that lesson, he said honestly, but I will tell you what I know so far. You grow old with grace by growing old with gratitude. Each day that you wake, you thank God for the gift of that day. Each person you encounter, you receive as a gift. Each task you do, you offer as worship. You do not cling to what is passing away, but you do not despise it either. You hold it gently, gratefully, knowing that everything is on loan, everything is gift, everything will eventually return to the giver. He paused, then continued. As for facing the end without fear, I do not claim to be without fear entirely. Death is a mystery, and mysteries can frighten us. But I have learned to trust that the God who has been faithful my whole life will be faithful in death and beyond death. He who led me through the valley of the shadow will lead me through the final valley, and on the other side, he smiled. On the other side, I believe I will see the completion of all that he began in me. I will understand fully what I now understand only in part. I will see his face, and in seeing it, I will be finally, completely home. Tears glistened in Micah's eyes. I will miss you, Master, when that day comes, and I will miss you, my son. But we do not say goodbye. We say, until we meet again. And we trust that in God's kingdom there is reunion for those who love him. Spring came again, as it always did, painting the world in green and gold. The almond trees blossomed, clouds of white and pink against the blue sky. The fields were plowed and planted. Life renewed itself, as it had for countless generations, as it would for countless more. Tobias woke one morning feeling different, not ill exactly, but aware of a change, a shifting. He rose from his bed slowly and went to the window. The sun was just rising, and the light was the color of honey, thick and golden and beautiful. Thank you, he whispered, for all of it, for every sunrise, for every sunset, for every person and every moment, for the work and the rest, for the questions and for the answers that came slowly in your time. Thank you. He dressed carefully, moving through the familiar motions of morning prayer, of washing, of preparing for the day. But he found himself moving toward the workshop, drawn by something he could not name. The workshop was quiet in the early morning light. The tools hung on their pegs, each in its place. The workbenches were clean, ready for the day's work. The smell of wood and oil was as familiar as his own breath. Tobias walked to the center of the room and simply stood there, remembering. He saw himself as a young boy, watching his father work, wide-eyed with wonder. He saw himself as a young man, restless and uncertain, searching for meaning. He saw himself through the years, learning, growing, changing. He saw the pieces he had made, the people he had served, the apprentices he had taught. It has been a good life, he said aloud to the empty workshop. A faithful life, not a perfect life, but a life lived in your presence, Lord. And that is enough. That is more than enough. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the familiar smells, feeling the texture of worn wood beneath his hands, listening to the silence that was not empty, but full of memory, full of meaning, full of presence. Then, with a sense of completion, he walked back to his house. He felt no pain, no distress, only a deep, deep peace, a sense that the work was finished, that he had run his race, that he could now, finally, rest. He lay down on his bed in the same room where he had slept as a child, where his father had slept before him. He closed his eyes and began to pray the ancient words of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And as he prayed, as the words flowed through him like water through parched ground, he felt himself being drawn upward, lifted on currents he could not see but could feel. The room around him seemed to fade, and in its place he saw light, pure, golden, welcoming light. And he heard a voice, or perhaps felt it more than heard it, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." Tobias smiled. He had heard these words before, in parables and teachings, but now he understood them. Now he experienced them, and in that moment all the questions of his lifetime found their answer. All the restlessness found its rest. All the seeking found its home. He let go, gently, peacefully, like a man setting down a heavy burden after a long journey, like a carpenter finishing the last piece of work and stepping back to see it completed, like a child falling asleep in his father's arms, knowing he is safe, knowing he is loved, knowing all is well. days. Micah found him later that morning, lying peacefully in his bed, his face serene, a slight smile on his lips. And though Micah wept, as was right and natural, he also felt something else, a sense that Tobias had simply moved from one room to another, from labor to rest, from the seen to the unseen. The village mourned together. They buried Tobias beside his father and Sarah in the tomb outside the village. The rabbi spoke words of comfort, reminding them that those who sleep in the Lord do not truly die but rest until the resurrection. And in the days that followed, people shared their memories. The young woman who had been afraid of marriage came and told how his words had given her peace. The young men he had counseled gathered and spoke of his wisdom. Customers returned to show furniture he had made decades ago, still solid, still beautiful, still serving faithfully. Micah took over the workshop fully now, continuing the work, teaching new apprentices, passing on not just skills, but the deeper lessons, the lesson of faithfulness, the lesson of offering work as worship, the lesson of trusting God's purposes even when they were not clear. And sometimes when the light fell just right through the workshop door, when the smell of cedar filled the air, when his hands moved in familiar patterns across the wood, Micah would pause and remember. He would remember his master, his teacher, his friend, and he would whisper a prayer of thanks. For the chain continued. The work went on. And the wisdom that Tobias had learned, first from his father, and then from Rabbi Eleazar, and then from a lifetime of faithful living, that wisdom was not lost. It lived on in the hands and hearts of those he had touched, those he had taught, those he had loved. And in the quiet moments, when Micah faced his own doubts and questions, he would remember Tobias's words, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Trust him with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Simple words, ancient words, words that had guided countless lives before and would guide countless lives after. Words that were true not because they were complicated, but because they were true. Words that had carried one faithful carpenter through a long life of ordinary days, transformed into extraordinary offerings. And so the story ends where it began, in a small village, in a humble workshop, with hands shaping wood and hearts shaped by God. The sun rises, the work continues, the faithfulness endures. And somewhere, in the mystery beyond our seeing, an old carpenter rests in the presence of the one he served all his days, finally understanding fully what he understood only in part, finally seeing face to face, finally home. Rest well, Tobias. Your work is complete. Your race is finished. Your faith has kept you. And now, dear listener, may you also rest. May the peace that guided Tobias guide you. May the faithfulness that held him hold you. May you know yourself loved, held, valued beyond measure. May you sleep this night in the certainty that you too are being shaped, guided, led by hands that are both gentle and strong. Commit your works to the Lord. Trust his purposes. Rest in his love. Peace be with you. Shalom.